Okay, well, thanks everyone for joining us. We'll let people in as they come. We're recording anyway, so that our colleagues can watch the recording from the CELC blog site, the journal. So we started off this dialogue session because Casey said that she'd like committees to do them. So there will be some other dialogue sessions from the assessment committee and the course curriculum design committee later on. And so what we wanted to talk about was, professional development as we're that committee, and particularly raise questions about Soto. And so we've designed our talk based on a question response kind of narrative. And so, we do want to make sure that everyone's aware that it's an open dialogue. So, questions, discussions at any stage are welcomed. So if you don't know us, the faculty development team are made up of myself, Victor, Namala, Darren, Jeanette, and Chloe. And can you see the slides here? Yeah, so we're going to take it in turns at just opening up the deck and dealing with these questions that we sent out as part of the email. So yeah, thanks again for attending, and we hope that you'll find it interesting and we'll all build some knowledge together today. So the first question was related to what makes SoTL different to scholarly teaching. Is there anyone who'd like to start the ball rolling on that question? What do you think? Someone talking there? What's in the background, perhaps?
Sorry, that's my background.
Oh, okay. I mean, this is something that's often brought up. What is scholarly teaching and how is it different to SoTL? So it's probably something that, we all know implicitly, but how much do we, think about it explicitly? So there is a paper that actually explores this, and you can see this Kern et al. Figure that talks about the differences between scholarly teaching and the scholarship of teaching and learning. And they use a Cartesian plane, as you can see, and it's based on levels of formality and based on levels of privacy. So they say that one big difference in SoTL is that it's in the public sphere and it's been reviewed. So normally it's been through some kind of systematic process. And they don't put down scholarly teaching at all. They just say that, in their opinion, that's the difference, the main difference. And so, yeah, when we do write SoTL, we're moving into that public domain and we're opening our work up to critique. And so that's why they say that it has that systematic process and it's more formalized. And I think that this other paper from Felton is quite interesting, particularly this notion of conducted in partnership with students. So I think that this is something that what we do relates to that, because normally we're trying to work on building our students' writing. So by doing that, we necessarily enter into a partnership. And Felton talks about authentic co-inquiry. So I think that's quite nice as well, as a principle of good practice for SoTL, and something that I think we should always aim towards. Would anyone like to join in at this stage? No? Okay. So that's the first part. Victor, over to you.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Mark. Okay, I'll just share my screen with you. Actually, I think it's not enabled to share at the moment, Mark.
Yeah, I've just done that, yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Right. Okay. So I'm just going to say a few brief words about ethics in SoTL. And then I just, again, as Mark did, invite contributions from others based on their own experience. So just going to briefly mention the IRB exemption criteria for SBER research, which SoTL falls under, and then make reference to a particular scholarly article, from the SoTL world on ethics in SoTL by Healy et al. A few words about that, and then, as I say, open to discussion. Okay, so these are the criteria set out for social, behavioural, and educational research, which SoTL applications may fall under. There are others beyond these which are, relevant to other dimensions of the SBER kind of research, but it seemed to me that the SoTL type of research would be captured under any one of these, essentially sort of 5 categories here. Obviously, 1A is the primary one, research conducted in established or commonly accepted educational settings involving normal educational practices, but that one is with no grades analysis. So there's a specific set of additional criteria when grades analysis is involved that I'm not going to trouble you with here, but if you're interested to look at the full set of criteria, you can go to the link at the bottom there. Okay, but I think underpinning these exemption categories is a concern that the research is of a kind that isn't going to pose any particular problems or harms to the participants involved, and at the same time it kind of respects their autonomy, their privacy, their ability to control information about themselves, and doesn't willy-nilly reveal confidential information or reveal information to other external parties, particularly if it relates to things like grades. So beyond those exemption categories, there are these specific criteria that capture the essence of what an exempted application would need to conform to. Firstly, that they're of minimal risk, and that is defined as the probability and magnitude of harm or discomfort anticipated in the research are not greater in and of themselves than those ordinarily encountered in daily life of the general population. So there's a very specific formulation that's captured kind of globally, regardless of the nature of research, even beyond the SBER type, that defines what minimal risk is. They should not involve a vulnerable population, nor touch on sensitive topics. And this is an additional criteria. All of these obviously need to apply. Does not involve deception or withholding of the study's stated aims and objectives from the participants. So though deception can be a legitimate part of certain research projects, and this may be particularly the case in maybe psychological studies or things that would fall more under the biomedical domain, the deception would need to be kind of inherent to the nature of the study, and it would need close review board oversight to ensure that it was done out of necessity and that other protections were in place for the sake of the participants. But standardly then, you wouldn't expect SBER research to involve any form of deception or withholding of aims. This article I thought was quite helpful to refer to. It defines SoTL inquiries as falling somewhere between quality assurance or enhancement and traditional academic research. They talk about ethical practice of SoTL being not about having the right answers, as it were, but being able to simply pass IRB review if any is required, or to simply meet the exemption criteria from review. But rather to be part of a mindset that is present within the researchers or the research team, it's more than one person, so that it becomes a more reflective process of thinking about the nature of practice and how it might potentially impact on participants, even after essential things like IRB approval have been obtained. So it's very much a kind of ongoing thing. They do offer a matrix in the next slide I'll share with you to establish the kinds of questions that might be raised in relation to 3 different categories of stakeholder under 3 different ethical traditions that they describe as teleological, pragmatic, external, and deontological. and it looks like this. It's quite a bit to kind of digest at a glance. This is their more sort of generic table. They've got a kind of worked example based on a case study to do with a physics class, where there was some interest in whether students were benefited by having formula sheets on hand when they were taking assessments. So if you want to see how these questions are broken down and applied in a more concrete sense, I'll refer you to the article, and you can look at a subsequent table that's got more specific questions. What I thought was interesting about it is that it tries and captures, you know, different groups of stakeholders, students and the institutional community, so those not sort of directly involved in but impacted by the research are considered in terms of what the SoTL inquiry aims to do, what sort of impacts it might have, both locally within the student group that's being studied, but also more broadly across the institution. And of course, it also looks at the researcher as both teacher and scholar. So that's why they emphasize in capitals there in the first column, educator, scholar, emphasis on educator in the first, and educator scholar, emphasis on the scholar in the second, so that you get a sense of what the priorities are in relation to wearing those different hats in the ongoing project. So some of these considerations, the teleological and pragmatic, are to do with consequences, that are foreseeable in terms of impacts on or implications for the different stakeholder groups. The external category is a slightly unusual one, but really it's more extended consequences across perhaps a wider array of parties, and it might, for example, involve the obtaining of IRB approval, the review board approval, under the scholar and the research community column there at the bottom. That could be one aspect where the consideration starts broadening out to other parties other than the researcher and the student group itself. The deontological is, grounded in Kantian style ethics concerned with respect to the person and their autonomy to make, choices about, whether to participate in the study in the first place, what happens with the data that the study captures, and if they're not comfortable with that, of course, they shouldn't be in any way pressed or coerced into participating. So these are really sort of fundamental kind of concerns. But you can see there in a more nuanced way how they're sketched out across the three different stakeholder groups, which I thought was quite useful. So just to provide a little bit of further commentary on that, the external category I thought was a bit odd, frankly. It's not one that I've kind of come across as an ethics scholar, whose PhD background is in ethics. Although these authors do provide an example of what they have in mind and refer to a particular ethical study, it's not really a tradition in and of itself, as you might think of consequentialism or deontology being ethical traditions. Rather, what it is a more extended consideration of consequences, which may be of a more extended or second order kind, consequences which are not so immediately foreseeable, but arise out of actions you've taken in a sequence. So one step removed, if you like, consequences, but still consequences nonetheless. The authors also said that one of the challenges is that the majority of SoTL practitioners lack formal training in ethics because they do not have philosophy backgrounds. And I'll make just 2 points here. Firstly, philosophy does not have a monopoly on ethics, either in the understanding of what ethical considerations consist in or how people should be trained in recognizing and responding to those kinds of concerns. You may come across, of course, other professionals, lawyers, data management experts, and others actually running ethics workshops. And obviously, why shouldn't they? You don't need a philosophy background per se to be knowledgeable about the nature of ethics. But at the same time, the other point I want to make is that sometimes when you find non-philosophers writing about ethics in a way that attempts to go a little bit deeper into kind of the normative kind of grounding frameworks for looking at ethics, they may reveal their lack of expertise in that area. So Healy et al. Do actually betray their own sort of lack of philosophical training, given that they come from a variety of other disciplines, physical sciences and social sciences. When they talk about deontology and Kant, and quote the Kantian principle as being one having an inherent duty to never use individuals as a means to an end, and that's actually a construal of Kant, or a misquote really. It's not just an interpretation that's wrong, it's actually the quotation itself is not correct. And the word merely should be inserted there, never merely as a means to an end, which does, I'm sure you appreciate, change the meaning considerably. So of course we are in a sense using students as a means to an end in gathering data so that we can further improve on our scholarly and pedagogical practices, but we're not using them merely in that way to the extent that we obtain their consent. So merely is a term that reminds us that we need to obtain the active kind of consent or buy-in from the participants in order to legitimize the kinds of uses in the way that we are making of them, for the generation of data for our analysis. Okay, so I thought that was just a little nuance that's worth mentioning, because it often crops up in sort of potted versions of Kant that term is left out, and it does rather change the meaning. Okay, that's all I've got to say about ethics in SoTL per se. I don't claim any particular expertise in ethical practice of SoTL, as I've not to this point really been a SoTL researcher. My research has been in other areas, more particularly to do with applied ethics. So I'm interested to hear what your experiences have been, as you may have encountered ethical issues, and then how you've responded to them. So that's the prompt question for my section to follow on from my talk. So what ethical issues have you encountered in your practice as SoTL researchers, and how have you handled them? Or do you have any concerns about ethical issues that you're not perhaps even sure whether they are ethical issues, but might like to float here to see how others respond to them? I'll stop my share there.
Thank you, Victor. I think one of the challenges that I've had in a few projects that I was involved in last year was the scope of, kind of like the scope of coverage, like what you said. We try to cover our bases, like, who might be involved or whose perspectives or might be reflected in our data, that kind of a thing. And we try to be as encompassing as possible, but sometimes we aren't able to capture everything necessarily. So for instance, there's this project that we're trying to finish up with Eileen, and we are using reflections as data. And in our initial IRB application, we had said that we will be very careful, with how we represent people who appear in our reflections, that kind of a thing. And we tried to be as specific as possible as to whom, who will be mentioned or who will come up in the reflections, as we go along the school year. But of course, I mean, that is not sufficient. And I find myself having a lot of discussions with Eileen about, but we never said this in our IRB. We never said that we would talk about this person, for instance, or because, we just didn't have that kind of foresight when we were doing the IRB application 2 or 3 years ago. So it kind of reduces what we can, say or write about or analyze when we get to the data analysis part, of our reflections, But the good thing was the IRB committee was very, very, I think we were the first few who submitted an application for data that comes from our own reflections, and the person who was helping with us was very keen on learning about this kind of research, But it's just that we caught ourselves here, in situations where we have to kind of just discard some data which we thought, would be interesting if
because it identified sort of named individuals, but you seem to be suggesting that it was part of the purpose to actually identify particular parties in a quite concrete way. In other words, not to kind of anonymize them or de-identify them.
Yeah.
Why was that the case?
Sorry.
Why was it the case that there was you felt a kind of need to try and identify individuals concerned or attribute particular reflections to them?
We were looking at, I mean, the research itself, we were using a relational analysis to see how we operated as unit coordinators. And, through relational analysis, we look at how we basically interact with different people who are involved in our course. And I think, at the point when we were doing our IRB, we were just thinking of our students and the tutors. But obviously, there are so many more other people involved, in how a course takes shape.
Darren,
Okay.
I have a question for you and also for Victor, because I like what Darren mentioned earlier, that the idea that they collected a lot of data and through the process of the analysis, they realized they were finding out more information that was kind of outside of the scope of the study. And that kind of relates to what I'll be presenting later, where you start out with a hypothesis, you start out with this participants in mind, but as you do the research, you realize that there are new information coming in or new permutations occurring. So what does that do? Does that become a limitation to the research findings or the analysis that you can do? Do you have to do what Darren said, put aside those data, maybe only address them in another research down the road? Would that be kind of a limiting factor in terms of the research we can do in our field?
Yeah, I suppose you could in theory go back to the IRB for sort of approval for the modification of the protocol to legitimize the incorporation of those other parties, but you'd have to be very transparent about that and do it obviously in the timely manner before you started involving those parties. So if you anticipated that your capture of the data might sort of extend further than was first intended, and involve other people that were not originally consented or things of that sort, you definitely need to go back to the IRB.
I just wanted to add to that to say that me and Letitia were involved in a publication in which we realized that the way that we approach that is very different depending on the power relation and status associated with it, whether you are looking at someone who you have oversight over in a sense, or whether you're looking at someone above you in a way. So we found that, directors of institutions, like there was one particular institution in which the director was saying, oh, I'm doing all these kinds of research and I want my staff to, critically reflect on things. I mean, and there are ethical concerns with that. The staff are like, are they being compelled to participate in the, do you know what I mean? Like they have to participate, right? This is their boss saying, I want you to critically reflect on your teaching practices, and then I'm going to use it for research. Now, at what point are you allowed to say no to that? And then the other way around is someone who's in that position where they're like, oh, this person is my boss. I can't say certain things about them that I might want to point out.
Yeah.
They're more identifiable because the structure gets smaller and smaller. So then everyone will know exactly who I'm talking about. So it's really interesting because you begin to realize that the power status relationship in the ethics and the way that it's spelled out in IRB is always, we have power over our students in some institutional sense, and we have to safeguard that. But there's nothing about who's above us and who do we have to sort of report and how do they feed into the overall structure in an institutional sense, I think.
Right. Yeah, we made very mindful, aren't we, of the need not to in any way kind of coerce students into participating, and to create kind of structures within the research protocol itself that allows people the kind of opt out possibility without it in any way kind of then impacting their learning at the same time. And there's some nice examples of that given in that article that I mentioned to you if you would like to look at that case study in it. But yeah, you raise a good point, Naman, about sort of institutional colleagues, and the power relations between them that might lead to people feeling like they have to somehow comply and be involved in something that they might otherwise not.
And even commenting on your own peers, right? At the same level as coordinators. You can't comment on something someone did, because if it's not something that, I mean, you can only say positive things, right? If you're going to say something negative, then is it that person's, that person's identity, their intellectual property, their process, their practice? You have to be very mindful of that. So it's a tricky area, I think.
And I think we had sought out to be broad, because we know that, when you're reflecting, anything can come up, that has an impact, big or small, on the class. And I think we sought out to be a little bit more, a little broader when we first wrote the first draft of our IRB. A while ago, I said that they were very keen on, learning this kind of research, but at the same time, they were also, I think, asking us to be a little bit more definitive about, okay, you're going to reflect, who are you going to reflect on? Now that I'm thinking about it. So, they wanted us to clearly articulate, who are we going to reflect on and what will we say about them. And Letitia mentioned autoethnography and, reflective studies, when we get into it, we don't necessarily have any specific
boundaries,
in mind. And So I think we started off on that note with IRB, I think, and then throughout the reflections throughout the year, I think over the 2 semesters throughout the year, I think we were kind of constrained to that because we didn't want to have any. It seemed that you know, when ALSET came to be, they were very how do you say, up to date with things that we were doing. They were always keeping tab on what we were doing in a good way, but also I felt that, oh, you know, I have to report to them, you know, certain things that we are doing. And like a few months ago, they asked us for like an update on what we have done so far and how far we have gone in our research, that kind of a thing. So I really don't want to ruffle feathers over there with them, especially when it comes
and critical reflection. If you look at the research, is so emancipatory and so, like, you know, transformative. You can say whatever you want, but it doesn't account for the fact that it's happening within these institutional structures of power within which there's so much accountability. And that's a really interesting point, Darren. I really like it, because I don't think we think of that.
I was just going to say, Darren, the thing is, if we, I mean, definitely when we are writing about our practice, we might refer to somebody else. And that is problematic depending on what we're saying and so on. But in a way, if we push that reasoning too far, then we're not able then to critique anything, right? Because in order to critique, let's say, power struggles, discrimination, we have to say it's happened. So, I mean, this is something that kind of, also in the project we're working on with NAM, other people are also doing autoethnography. So that's what they're asking. They're saying, so if I write this in my situation, the person who said that to me will recognize herself, but I want to show how that discrimination was expressed to me or othering was done to me and so on. And so we have those conversations. Is it just a matter of risk? Is it a matter of ethics? What is it? It's quite difficult.
It is.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the concern is whether the person is not just recognizable to themselves, but to others, where any sort of reputational harm would be done. I mean, that clearly crosses the line into an ethical consideration where there's reputational damage that could result from, even if it's only perceived by, you know, a very select group of people or individual even, that would be a concern. But the person themselves, recognizing themselves, though kind of de-identified in the data it's written up.
That is a good point. Yes, they can recognize themselves, but they're not. But other people shouldn't. So it's not a sort of attack on their reputation, because of course autoethnography is also extremely subjective. So you are just presenting what you see that person said to you, and so it is very ethically problematic, I think.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, these are questions to reflect on, you know, even aside from IRB protocols and the sort of strict conformance to what's required, or whether something requires further IRB approval, or is it kind of deviation from the originally approved protocol? So they're rightly, you know, questions we should continue to ask ourselves and reflect on as practitioners in the way that Healy et al. Advocate, you know, in their paper. Good. Okay, just keep you on the time mark. Thanks, Letitia. That's great.
Thanks, Victor.
12:30. Should we move to the next section, do you think?
Sure. Okay, Chloe, are you going to show us your slides?
Just give me a second. Let me go ahead and share the slides. I really think that it was quite meaningful to have this ethical discussion prior to this portion of the presentation, because I was going to go into different kinds of methodologies when it comes to social research. Okay, so this was something I came across as a young social researcher, and oftentimes it was a dilemma how I would enter into the social research sphere with my research questions, or how would I go about doing a research project. So this particular paper I found it very useful because the authors Miller, Young, and Yo lined up the methodologies right next to learning theory. And by aligning these two different elements together, they really wanted to expand the researcher's idea of potential approaches for social research. So they were trying to construct like a conceptual framework for SoTL. This is really nothing new to many of us here, but really looking at it together on a table and looking at the points of synergy was really useful for me to really think about how I want to approach a particular study or a particular learning or teaching question that I might have. So they really highlighted the three contributing factors: theoretical grounding, methodological rigor, and of course the research question. But what these two authors wanted to express was that a lot of research currently in SoTL are often empirical, quantitative, and very generalized studies. But they were suggesting that having a broader range of perspectives and entry points to SoTL would give us the benefit of studying, learning, and teaching from very diverse perspectives. So that's what prompted this paper. That's what prompted them to really map out the different kinds of learning theories and the corresponding methodologies and assumptions of knowledge behind them, and then use that and examine some of the SoTL research that were occurring within their institution. So of course, they did a brief recap of some key learning theories that we often engage with in the field of SoTL, everything from behaviorism to social constructivism, and something I think was relatively less discussed, the idea of humanism. So looking at the learner as a whole person, not only looking at learning and teaching, but also pastoral care, individual well-being of the learner. So those are the kind of learning theories they suggested. But what I thought was really interesting in the paper was the way they defined methodology. So they highlighted that when we go about doing a study, we shouldn't think so much as the physical method, the actual action that we're going to do, but also consider the methodology that we're about to adopt for our research, because that answers questions like, what is our assumptions entering this study? What is the kind of knowledge, our worldview or our perspective on this particular area of learning and teaching? And I think what was really interesting that Darren and Victor and Namala was pointing out got me thinking, because many of us step into doing research with a hypothesis in mind, certain fixed research questions in mind, with this idea of generalizing what we find. But more and more, you notice that some of us are involved in like naturalistic studies, interpretive studies that involve very specific situated contexts. We use ethnography, we use inductive theorizing. So it's really interesting that they brought up the IRB and ethical approvals, because I'm also wondering how, when we do something more organic, like naturalistic studies and interpretive studies, how can we forecast what we need to cover in our IRB and ethical approvals, but at the same time, not restrict the possible findings and analysis that we can draw from these kind of more organic research. And in particular, the author also mentioned that a lot of times these naturalistic studies and interpretive studies are very subjective in terms of reality. So I totally agree with Letitia. It could potentially factor into like things like power relationships, and it could cause a lot of friction depending on how we interpret our findings and the kinds of analysis that we draw. But yes, also what Namala mentioned, like critical theory is something that is also an area that the authors are encouraging many teachers and educational researchers to go into in the field of SoTL, not just looking at teaching and learning in terms of what works, but I thought this was very meaningful, but also considering justice and ethics, and also thinking about how these inequalities actually impact the pedagogical space in our classroom. And for me, this is particularly meaningful because back when I first started my career in teaching, I was working a lot with EFL learners, and many of them were actually immigrants and refugees, and they came from very diverse backgrounds. So one of the research studies I did was in a EFL classroom, which I'll talk a little bit more very shortly. But just to go back to the study, so the author actually, in this paper, if you have time to look at it, they went through a series of different research that was occurring in the institution. A couple of them that I found very interesting was, for example, the one Research C, which is a blend of naturalistic methodology and social constructivism. And this author was actually doing an ethnographic research, and he was trying to do a personal reflection to see whether his own upbringing, his own educational training influences the way he analyzes or he evaluates his students. And I think from all of us here, that is something really valuable because we're teaching in an international university. So what was interesting, and this kind of relates back to what Darren mentioned, this particular researcher also used a lot of classroom interviews, classroom observations, in-person classroom observations, student interviews. So he was participating in this observational process, so very much in ethnographic research. And he was noting down his various research findings, but many of these are actually what we inductive theorizing. He was working backwards, and he was not letting his assumptions or his own upbringing limit the findings of his research. So I thought that this was very interesting because when many of you mentioned that IRB approval is required, I wonder how this plays and factors into social research that are more naturalistic. And also in that example below here is interpretive. I haven't ran into any particular issue in my career yet, but as a student researcher back in graduate school, I actually had experience over a 1-year study, over 2 semesters. We started out looking and exploring into social constructivism, and the area I was interested in learning about more was group learning dynamics, collaborative learning. And I went into this particular study with a few assumptions, as usual, doing your research, your readings. I went into it with some assumptions. So it was a very objective and generalized approach to studying. But within one of my classrooms, this was a classroom involving a lot of Middle Eastern students. And it was an interesting classroom dynamics because they were all male students and only one female student. And there was one time she actually pulled us aside and made me, I was the TA in the class, and the instructor promise not to reveal to the students that she is married. And she said that if we revealed that she was married, none of the male students in the classroom would participate in any collaborative activities with her because it would not be appropriate. It was these kind of observations and conversations that kind of led it into becoming like a naturalistic study, because going back into my reflections, I realized that I had drawn a lot of my own personal assumptions into what collaborative learning is all about, but I didn't include the social cultural context of my students as well as I thought I did. So that led to a very different study at the end. But because it was a student research, so there wasn't really a lot of IRB issues at that point in time, but it's definitely something I would consider down the road. Yeah. So yeah, this is kind of my little reflection on how to conceptualize social research and looking at methodologies and theoretical frameworks and not thinking of them as separate from one another, but thinking of them more as a fluid scale that you will shift depending on your research findings, depending on your own development in the conceptualizing of your research process. Yeah. So I would love to hear more about all of you, because I think everyone here has significantly more experience. Any difficulties or the kind of process you go into when you conceptualize your own social research.
Fascinating, Chloe. I loved it. I love that table that you looked at as well. Can I see that again? Sorry, I'm just trying to.
Okay, let me give you the bigger table.
Going through so much stuff. I'm trying to. The previous one. I wanted to see the. Sorry, I'm making you do what I do with my students. Go back to that slide so that I can think about it some more.
Which one is it? The one with the case studies?
No, this is great. This one. I just wanted to.
The one that got me really confused was the postmodern methodology. That really is my first time coming across it. But it's meant to deconstruct what we know and reconstruct something new.
Oh my God, me and my IEM, deconstructing grand narratives of nationalism, and then using theoretical frameworks to uncover those grand narratives. Truth, knowledge, power, self-language. Okay. I think it's interesting you were talking about how, in the assumptions that you bring to the classroom, you were talking about, how you positioned as a participant within the classroom, and how all of those beliefs that you bring in about what is good teaching practices and everything inform the way in which you interact with the students. And I think in capturing all of that, you were really going through sort of the critical reflection process that we're sort of forced to do in appraisals, or we're forced to do when we're applying for promotion, and that I think is already a part of developing into research. You know what I mean? I think it's just that next step of being able to say, okay, is this a study that's good enough that I can now think about writing it up or publishing it or talking about it in a conference? It's just, is so interconnected in that way.
I think you're right, Namala. I think like a lot of times I find that many of us do our critical reflections very instinctively. So when I came across this paper, I was like, oh, good. Now I can actually quantify or make what I am reflecting instinctively more tangible, and potentially then frame it into a formal social research question down the road. Yeah,
it's about making it visible and kind of really thinking through those processes, which most of the time we just, like you said, do intuitively, or we just think about it, or we just remember it, and then we just kind of don't force ourselves to sit down and systematically record it, which is like the hard part in a sense.
Chloe, did you say that your study was over a year, the ethnographic one? So I think that's another thing that's quite hard for us to do, isn't it? Because our context changes every 3 months. We might teach the same subject, but we don't teach the same students.
Exactly. Yep.
So it's quite hard to do that sort of research as well. I think, our structure really opens up more to that qualitative empirical than the others. Although I do think that I draw quite a lot from critical and postmodern as well. I think that talks about what, Felton says about involving the students in the research process as well. So that's trying to balance out those power relations between teacher and student. More humanist approach in that way. But yeah, I think it's hard for us to be involved in longitudinal studies.
And I find that some of the hypothesis-driven quantitative studies, which sort of dominate higher education research, can also be reductive. These kinds of nuanced instances of what happens in the classroom are also so valuable, but there's a lot of emphasis put on sort of learning outcomes. Have they been reached? Can we quantify the way they've been reached? That is not as valuable maybe as showing the process that a teacher goes through, because so much of it is the trial, the error, something worked really well, something didn't. It's much more, I feel that the naturalistic and the interpretive is a really interesting area to sit in, and it's difficult. I think it's challenging. For sure.
I think that like one of the reasons why I emphasize that I did this kind of research as a student teacher was also because I came across another article that mentioned that oftentimes the kind of research we do are also influenced by the way we are assessed in the institutions that we work in. As professionals, how are we assessed in our institution, and that would in a way influence the kind of research we do, like making sure that we do research to show how we have achieved our student learning outcomes and all that. And definitely there's more stake involved. So I can see why there are the quantitative studies are more common in higher education.
I remember going to, like, when I first joined, going to one of those the teaching sort of I don't know what they're called, seminars or whatever it is, run by CDTL, where they run
the PDPT thingies. Yeah.
Oh goodness, yes, I've completely forgotten the name of it. Yeah. Okay, PDPT. Thank you, Chloe.
You're welcome. It's still in my mind.
I was like, oh no, what is it called? But I remember them showing us these different frameworks in higher education, trying to push people from the disciplinary perspective into understanding that higher education is its own discipline. And it was completely quantitative. And when we got to the end of it, I was like, oh my God, my experience is entirely qualitative. So I was like, oh, why didn't you talk about that? And they actually said, because it's too hard, because you have to be trained to do it. And it's such a shift in mindset to go into that sort of things can go wrong, and I can talk about things that didn't work in a way that's not quantifiable. And, you know, they said discourse analysis is so hard, picking out phrases, content analysis is so big and messy. And there just didn't seem to be any sort of expertise or, you know, people who felt comfortable with that approach at that time. When, you know, when I first joined like 5 years ago, when they were just starting to talk about, you know, moving to educator track and the value of education-based research, which NUS doesn't really have as much as other institutions which have an education faculty, for instance. So I found that fascinating how much of that was considered too hard and requiring too much new knowledge that needed to be acquired in a very short amount of time by people who were experts in other disciplines and didn't want to learn something new, essentially, outside their realm of comfort, I guess.
It was interesting because my version of PDPT, I think a lot of what I noticed was they were looking at more teaching practice rather than the theory behind it. So they didn't really explore the different kinds of learning theories or, you know, assumptions, but they were pushing a lot of communicative and interactive learning.
Yes.
Without explaining the reason behind it or without exploring, you know, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I agree. Yeah.
Shall we move on? Thanks, Chloe. Shall we move on now?
I think Letitia has a
Oh, sorry, right.
Oh, it's okay. It was just a bit marginally related. I just think generally NUS and maybe Singapore, there is that kind of bias towards quantitative. We find it in our students. I find in IM2 we're guiding them into research. Half of the semester is spent telling them actually it would be better if you looked at this qualitatively. They all have this quantitative reasoning module, don't they? But I don't think they have the equivalent for qualitative. And so, I mean, that is just maybe a reflection of generally of the educational system and a preference for measuring things quantitatively. So it's true that for us, for scholarship and smaller classroom-based studies, there's maybe not a lot of support from apart from like these little groups here at the CELC, but maybe not campus-wide. That's what I wanted to say.
I came across a lot of the word atheoretical when you read a lot of subtle research. Yeah, people claim it's atheoretical because of all the qualitative research that we do. Yeah.
Yes, that's very problematic. I have to tell my students, yes, it can be rigorous because they come out with this, and so everything they talk about, they go back to generalizability. So all their vocabulary comes from the quantitative side. Anyway, thank you very much.
I give them a reading on what's called naturalistic generalization, and in qualitative research, how they talk about an in-depth overview, a narrative which is, you know, looking at depth rather than breadth, and how people with different perspectives, different stakeholders, can draw different meanings from a text. So I talk to them about non-probabilistic generalization, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense. That's logical." So, you know, but I always get small sample size, not generalizable as a limitation to their studies.
You should send me that reading, Mark, if you don't mind. That might be useful for my students. Thank you.
I think it's me next. Sorry, I just realized I was hijacking that amazing conversation by sharing my slide. Is it me next? It is, right, Mark? Yeah, okay. So I'm just going to bounce off what Chloe was talking about in terms of, you know, what kinds of theories do you use and how do you go about developing that into a research question. But I'm just going to use one of my own examples within my own classroom context. And I'm just introducing a theory that I keep in mind that helps me understand where I situate myself in terms of, you know, each individual project that I bring in. Where does it fit in terms of the overall classroom cycle of teaching? So I'm going to just basically focus on the topic of research and developing a question for it. I mean, I know that all of you are very well versed in that as well, but I would like to know what kind of different approaches everyone uses. I think that would be very interesting. So just research in SoTL just has this idea that SoTL is public, susceptible to critical review and evaluation. They talk about the fact that there has to be a public account of some or all of the full act of teaching. So what is this full act of teaching, and how do I conceptualize that in relation to the theoretical frameworks I bring in? I think one of the really valuable things that we have in our community within CELC is the fact that all of us come from such strong higher research education-based backgrounds. I think a lot of our colleagues working in pure SoTL come from disciplinary insights, and therefore they just don't have the chemists working in chemistry, and that's their research area. And then they find that higher education research is another entirely different beast that they have to engage with, particularly if they're publishing in that area, which we're encouraged to do, because the scholarship of teaching and learning is about reflecting on our own processes and practices in a sort of a more visible and a more systemic manner. So I'm interested in looking at the full act of teaching and what does that actually mean. And I like to look at it in relation to what works and doesn't work in my classroom. So I love the doesn't work ones. I think that that was one of the valuable things that I learned from the idea of critical reflection, which is usually based on what went wrong in the classroom. But I think that that's useful, because I think most of the time we would look at something and think, oh my goodness, why did that not work? How do I adjust that? But then I also like to look at what really worked well. And I'm going to look at an example of some things that worked well and some things that I see my students picking up and really demonstrating within a single cycle of me teaching them something. So I'm trying to teach them an aspect of research, and then I find that they're able to demonstrate that to me. And I often think I'm doing it sort of intuitively. And then it's nice to be able to look back and think, what are the processes I went through, and systematically trying to record that. So I find that a really useful part of being able to do SoTL research. So I want to try and make systematically visible my own teaching practices, and I use a specific theoretical framework to do that. So like I said, when they talk about what is theory in SoTL, for us, we have useful theories that we draw on. If we're from an EFL background, we draw on TESOL, EFL, EAP. And many of us are from linguistics-based research, Victor from ethics. We draw on those different aspects to look at higher education research, as opposed to many of our colleagues, I think, who come from completely different disciplines. So Hutchings, for example, talks about this idea of the elephant in the room. Is SoTL research real research? That's a question that's being asked, because many of the people who come into SoTL are not actual education research experts, and they're going up against an enormously established body of theory as newcomers, when they're experts in their own discipline. So I'm sure some of you have encountered that, where you read a SoTL paper and you think this seems a little bit thin in comparison to the kind of research that I'm used to in higher education. And that's because we come from I think a much more experienced background. So what kinds of theories are relevant is a question that Hutchings and Huber ask. They ask, what's the role that these different theories play in different disciplinary contexts? And they talk about things like building on and contributing to theory. I think that last one is particularly challenging. And I always like to think it's okay if I'm not extending the theory when I'm presenting my research. I remember Luca and Chung, they have an article about Asian scholarship of teaching and learning, and they talk about how much of SoTL, just as higher education research, just as research in general, is dominated by Western perspectives. So they ask this question of what can we bring as insights from the Asian perspective, right? To not let Western scholarship dominate the way in which we understand education and what's successful. So I like to think of sometimes just being able to write a paper in which we're just looking at how did this particular piece of teaching and learning function and work well within our context. And that's what I try to focus on. So for me, the research, this idea of students' authenticity, right? The kinds of higher levels that research is supposed to reach to, thinking about things like elements of social justice. I certainly try to extend on that in relation to looking at the specific pedagogical frameworks that I try to deploy in my classroom. Certainly student authenticity is one of the ones that I'm concerned about, which is, making sure that students are given effective models, but you don't limit their creativity in doing that. Instead, you're giving them tools with which they can do a lot more in terms of looking at the context in which they function. So I'm looking at what is a nation, and I was looking at a specific bit of research that I did on that, and I used the teaching and learning cycle. So this is really what I wanted to introduce. For me, it's like a really nice a nice basic model, which helps me think about where am I entering into my research. I remember when I first started publishing and even talking in conferences, I had one of my supervisors took me aside and just sort of told me, you don't have to have your entire PhD thesis somehow worked out and, presented in 20 minutes. You can do a tiny little segment of it. Pick one thing from the cycle. And I was like, oh, yes, that's an excellent point. So try and focus on deconstruction. What activities do I use to, scaffold critical reading or joint construction? How do I, what kind of things do I do in consultations with my students? And then I see successful outcomes. My students have taken that up. Or, independent construction, looking at excellent student models and deconstructing that in class. So for me, it's about entering in and out of this model. And I think Mark's going to talk about that in relation to the overall process in terms of the teaching and learning cycle. So I just wanted to show you the kinds of things that I would have written about and that I'm interested in. I'm not going to go through the research cycle so much to say I've got joint construction of texts, for instance, in class. So, things that my students work on, how they use particular frameworks to analyze the kinds of artifacts that we bring into the classroom. So this is something that my students did on a Google Doc. And it's just interesting for me to see how students move through the use of analytical frameworks. So using specific theoretical meta language like eye-level language, eye-level angle, far distance, and then interpretation, what does it mean? Pushes for equality, a sense of urgency to help, and then go to the next level to try and bring in elements of nationalism, which is the goal of the course. I also like to look at this not only in terms of my students' work, what are they doing in the classroom, but also in terms of academic research, right? Deconstructing academic models and journal articles, etc. I feel like I'm really preaching to the choir here, right? You guys are already experts in this. But then also looking at my students' models. So I like to give my students excellent models of things that they've written. Sometimes I've taken it from other classes. So in the past, for instance, I've had Jean share with me some of his excellent student models, and I've used them in my class. I've done that with Letitia's work as well, and Mark's. It's nice for me to be able to say across IEM, students are producing the kind of work that is similar in terms of how they convey their meanings, and then allowing students to go through these kinds of text annotation and highlighting methods to try and make them aware of the language that's being used, and then writing that process up, something as simple as just writing that process up, which is what I did for an article for one of Mark's chapters, Mark's books, which is on CELC, which basically looks at a number of different IEMs. So for me, really, I don't veer too far into theory. I draw on SoTL in terms of the big ideas. Like I love the ideas of like personal flourishing, social justice, emancipatory learning. I love those ideas, but I feel that often in much of SoTL research that stays at the level of abstraction. And I want to see how does that actually work in my classroom? And if I find evidence of it, and if I'm being intuitive about that evidence, like Chloe said, I'm like, this is a really good example of a student demonstrating their capacity for authentic learning, then I want to try and make that process visible. And I always go to the same framework, something like the teaching and learning cycle, which I'm an expert in, I feel comfortable in, and then I find a way of delving into one part of that framework and then making that process visible in terms of my own publications. Yeah, so I just wanted to know what other theories are people using, do they feel comfortable with when they're looking at higher education research? So what do you use? So Darren, for instance, what would you use? Is there like a particular theory that you go back to, or any papers that you think are useful? Marissa, I know, is from a similar background in SFL.
You mentioned deconstruction just now, and in my sharing later on, I think that's one of the things that we did with regards to our feedback practices, which I don't know, for the most part, at least for me, it seems so natural, like, you know, okay, the essay came in, I'm gonna give feedback, that kind of a thing, but then having to just take a step back and then really looking at the feedback that I gave, yeah, and that process of, I know you're talking about deconstructing text and things like that, but
no,
in my practice,
I definitely,
yeah.
deconstructing feedback, absolutely, where you think, why did this get picked up and the student was able to do this? And that worked, but this is something that the student is not able to understand. And why is that the case? Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that is, I mean, approaches in the same family as deconstructing things or concepts, I think are, those concepts are very important when when the whole research paradigm, or the approach that we're taking is one that is reflexive, or one that forces us to rethink our teaching practices, for instance, or the materials that we use. So
and I like to have it. One of the things I remember with the PDPT that was good was one of the really senior members in, like a dean, I can't remember what his name was, came in, and he was basically one of the people who was there from the inception of the university, and he was basically retired, and he had been asked to come in and talk about whose careers he thinks were successful. And he said that the people who found something that worked and then researched that, and that became the expertise, they didn't spread themselves too thin. And he said, don't spread yourself too thin and just say, oh, that's interesting, I'm gonna look at that. And then that's interesting, I'm gonna look at that. Because then he's like, then when the time comes for you to be, in the higher echelons, you're starting to think about associate professorship, for instance, you can't show a portfolio which says, I am an expert in feedback, or I know how to deploy this particular framework well. And I remember thinking, oh, that's a really good piece of advice. And I always find that if you're critically reflecting in your appraisal, you can then use that to critically reflect in your teaching awards. You can use that to critically reflect on your practices and write that up or present that in a conference. So always get the maximum out of a really well thought out piece of research, I think, is really useful, rather than trying to find something new to look at every time.
I mean, we're already so busy as it is. I think, that's a good approach.
It's the only way to do it. Yeah. And it was something that when he said it, he was like, don't do new things all the time. And I was thinking, yeah, that's really good. And I have consistently drawn on that, where I've said, okay, I'm just going to look at little bit by bit. And I think for people like Mark and Victor, who've taught in the same course and had that privilege of being able to investigate their practices within a single course for a long time, like a sustained scholarship in that sense. It's just an amazing privilege to be able to then become an expert in that subject, and also publish in ethics, as well as publish in sports sociology, as well as do higher education research in that, because they've been looking at that for such a long time, right?
Yeah, it's definitely been a privilege. We've always positioned ourselves, haven't we, in the I&E program as being kind of critical co-investigators with students as they take on research. So it's quite interesting to hear about them being sort of brought into the realm of our SoTL research as kind of collaborators in that sense too, so that we don't sort of presume to kind of have higher knowledge or superior knowledge about everything over our students, but we kind of travel with them. So that's been the really privileging and empowering part of it, I think.
It's impossible to know everything, isn't it, about the subject, and they always bring in new subject matter that we learn from every semester.
Don't they? Definitely.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've got such an enormous, like a chunk of like growing work that I have aside of students who just brought in things that just completely surprised me and was like, oh my God, how did you do that? Like, it's incredible what they can produce and how much you can learn from them. And then you think, that's an amazing reading, I'm going to use that. And you email them and you're like, I'm going to use that reading in my next semester because it was fantastic. Like, it really, so they just teach you so much, I think, about the subject matter. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, my challenge this semester has been trying to teach students to work with kind of normative ethical frameworks in application to particular questions they'll come up with. The questions they come up with are excellent, really interesting ones, but they do struggle to kind of grapple with the theory in a way that's actually likely to produce a meaningful output. In other words, what they try and do is kind of overreach, and they try and combine different frameworks which are not particularly compatible with each other, and you have to keep talking them back. It's like less is more. Don't try and do so much. It's a bit like the advice you were just kind of sharing with us about not trying to be sort of too eclectic and try and be interested in too many things at once. They're also a bit like that, and maybe that it's the empiricist sort of background that makes them very mindful to kind of show evidence and, you know, tick off boxes, and, you know, it's always good to do more rather than less, but not always the case, is it, when you're working at a theoretical level and you want to do stuff that goes kind of deep rather than sort of superficial?
Yeah, it seems, especially that you know, going into one or two texts and really, or looking at one issue in great depth, really hard for students. They want to go for the, I've looked at 1,000 texts and across all of them I can generalize, you know. So they're like, I can see the big data students, just like the data analysis students are like they said, oh my goodness, did this study looked at four texts? Like, they're deeply distressed by that. But I'm like, look at the level of detail that they can go to in their analysis, because they're looking at less text. So depth rather than breadth is, it's an alien concept, I guess, especially because of the big, you know, the emphasis is on big data in analysis and research, right? But then even then you see sometimes they come up with the most boring claims about things. You're like, okay, so you analyze thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of, you know, tweets, and then you came up with something that everyone already knew, because it was the overwhelming information that came up, you know, 5 or 6, you know. It's just, yeah, it amazes me how they value that, because they think of it as a body of growing evidence, I think.
I think some of my students in ES 1103 gets the security that if I don't know what I'm doing, but if I throw everything onto the paper or into this project, I will hit something, you know. And you have to sit them down and say, you know, it's about critical analysis. I want to see what you have to think about this topic, not what everyone else has to say. You know, don't get steered by what you're reading, but really choose one topic and commit to it. Yeah.
Anyone like to add anything, or shall we move on?
Sorry, if I can just add something.
Yes,
it was just so interesting listening to all this, you know, because I mean, when you have like computer science students, right, a lot of the time they're like, you know, why are you only looking at one text, or, you know, you're looking only at 2, and they'll ask you questions about statistics and generalizability and things like this, you know. But I don't know, for me, I find that interesting in a way, because it helps provide a sort of starting point, you know, from there to show them, you know, how things can potentially be done differently, right? And how some of them are so resistant to it, right? Because it's something that, you know, it's like their lifeblood of their major, right? You know, if you try to like tell them otherwise. But then you have those who, you know, really try to see from a different point of view. And I find that whole experience, you know, something gratifying in a way, you know, like you sort of break the 4 walls in that sense, right? Arts practitioners are always talking about that, you know, like break the 4 walls, and then you expand the space a lot more, right? So I find it something, you know, in a sense that, yeah, annoying, irritating, but, you know, but challenging in itself, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, it's not so much annoying as I think it's just, I just like the idea of them being all able to have access to that. I feel that IEM is just a few students, you know, or it might be in a classroom, you might have a little bit of time to spend on that. But I wish that, you know, as Letitia was saying, they have that quantitative model. I wish they had qualitative reasoning so that they could see, you know, how do you go into interviews and focus group data and all of these other rich materials that allow you to see, rather than numbers and statistics, you know, human interaction. And
yeah, so I try to allow them to bring both things in, you know, because sometimes they say, I find this in my interview data. Then I say, bring your statistics in then, you know, if it helps, you know, and supports it, right? And gives, and they'll be like, oh, okay. And then, you know, you kind of see, they're like, oh, it's complementary, you know, it's not two, you know, exclusive things, right? Exactly, right? And that's fun, you know, for those who are open to it, of course, but for those who are not, you know, because they're like, okay, this is just a waste of my time, then it's like, it's really sad, you know, when you see that happening. Yeah, but yeah, I just thought I'll just share that, you know, because I see, you know, benefits in both, and when it comes together in a way, and then when the student themselves say, can I do this, you know, on top of what they've done, right, or qualitatively, you've dragged them to do it, they're like, oh, can I do this? And you're like, yeah, sure, you know, and it's a nice marriage of both, right, that works for both sides. Yeah, thanks
Marissa.
Okay, shall we move on then? So I'll try and do mine in a very short space of time, because it'd be great if Darren and Jeanette can have the time to talk. So I just wanted to share research cycle. So this is something that we're all used to, where we can all identify, I think, with this process. And I think that we're fitting into what Chloe was talking about with regards to the qualitative empirical study, which kind of reflects our life world a little bit, that, the short semesters, etc. It's a study that I published for the IATEFL ESP SIG. They invited me to publish it based on a talk I did in Hong Kong. And what I was finding was, because my students were from disciplines like engineering, they tended to use this sort of information-fronted citation, and they were tending to overuse it a lot. And at least 5 were almost totally doing this in their lit reviews. So I was, I'm not used to seeing this sort of, overuse, but I know that in other disciplines, students are actually encouraged to do this and not use author-fronted citation. So I wanted to know whether in my field, we're citing in the same way or not. So I started looking at the 12 papers that I'd chosen as course readings. And I started noticing the ways that they were referring to other authors. And I saw, that they were often using reporting verbs, they were often using adverbial phrases, often using prepositional phrases. So, we always tell our students, look at model texts, but I was just wondering to what extent they're able to notice how the readings are written. And so, I thought to myself, how can I try to conceptualize, an intervention? So I looked at ways of reporting. So this is taken from Martin and White, ways that you can report other authors' work. This taxonomy on different research, cognition and discourse axes taken from Ken Hyland, who talks about reporting verbs. And so I was thinking, okay, how can I conceptualize an intervention? And then I read about 4A, an extended theme. So she puts the prepositional phrase or the adverbial and the reporting verb and the subject of the clause together as an extended theme. So I thought, rather than using SFL, talking about marked and unmarked themes, which might be a bit, tricky in my time frame, I thought I could use 4A's model, because those extended themes, they're author-fronted basically for citations. And I also did some reading on coverage ratios in text, like this Andy Gow paper, who did corpus-based study and compared coverage ratios of linking adverbials in academic writing, like thus, however, etc. And I thought this is quite an interesting concept. So I'm moving through that process. This is my response development, and I did a pre-intervention test. So I using NVivo, I built up a corpus with my readings from the module, and I did the same with 30 student texts, not 60, 30, so that the corpus would be roughly the same size to work with. Of those 30, there were about 5 who were definitely using author-fronted, but about 10 who generally tended to do that. And I just started, analyzing. So that the number of reporting verbs was quite distinct between the journal papers and the students' first drafts in the lit review. So, if you look at the bottom here, you'll see that the journal papers had 26 types of reporting verbs, and these occurred 65 times through those 12 text literature reviews. But however, the students had, 16 types, and these only occurred 27 times. So that's kind of me saying, all right, so yeah, there is something here with that information fronted versus author fronted citations. looked at the prepositional phrases and the adverbial phrases. And again, quite a distinct difference in the literature reviews from the published papers and those of the students. So only 7 types for students, but more importantly, only 11 times these occurred compared to 48 in the published papers. So, you know, this is really a way for me to see how the published papers behave in this way and how that contrasts with students' writing. So I decided to share this kind of research with the students. I actually showed them the tables and talked to them about the differences. And then we looked at the papers and did some text mining. So these are just some examples that the students found themselves, like Prebish remarks that sport. This was from a journal called Quality Market Research. It's on football fandom. For example, Wright and Cote found that competing. Gould et al. Found that. In fact, this Psychology of Sport and Exercise paper uses found, you know, four times in this paragraph, so overuses it. But in this paper, Journal of Broadcast and Electronic Media, this was on esports and how women are the sexism in esports. So you can see here in Kendall's case study of Blue Sky, masculinity was preferred. So, you know, this is the kind of activity that we did as an intervention. I got the students to start noticing the readings. After that, their second drafts came in, and you can see that their scores are completely different. So now they're using reporting verbs 78 times, in their lit reviews, the same students. Here they're using circumstantial adjuncts 52 times, and the types as well have expanded. So this is how it looks qualitatively in a text from a student who was, you know, overusing the information-fronted citations. So now I've put those in blue, so they're still quite common, but you can see much more variety. And what I've done here on the left side is I've summarized the changes. So first of all, what the published readings had, so 26 types of reporting verbs occurring 65 times, and I've given the mean there, 0.039 per paper. But then you can see how for students it changed, so from 1627 to 3178. So, you know, this was based on noticing of readings while they were doing their research as well. Here, with regards to prepositional phrase and adverbial phrases, you can see what the lit review findings were: 10 types, 48 times. The students' drafts moved from 7 and 11 to 18 and 52. So again, a start significant. But if you look at the means, you'll see that it's still quite significantly lower than the actual published papers. So 0.039 for the published, 0.018, 0.029, 0.012. So still lower, but you can see a marked difference. And so for me, that really helped me to see how this particular element is, you know, is visualized. And I think it also helped my students as well to see how it's visualized, and it really helped them to notice texts a bit more in my field. So based on my reflections, this is of my response evaluation, I would say that it really helped me to get to know the texts we were working with. I would say that it helped me to think about how I can focus on target language. But, you know, I think the main difference is it helped me to discern a difference pre and post intervention at both the individual and the group level using a corpus-based research approach. So yeah, that's all I wanted to do, talk about a particular research cycle that I've used in the past. Yeah, that's my point. So I wanted to ask you, you know, have you done corpus-based studies like this with your students' work? And, you know, how effective have you found them in the past?
I've done this a couple of times over the last few semesters with the ES 5001A students, and thank God NConc is downloadable for free. One thing I noticed though is to be able to use it successfully, I have to have a few runs with the students, because my students, I don't know, I always assumed that their computer literacy skills are higher than mine, but I always find myself having to go through at least a few sessions, a few rounds, with the software, with NConc, for example, or Antword Profiler, which is another one that I use from Professor Lawrence. We have to go through a few times in class on how to use it, how to use the software. Yeah. I think that's one of the, they do see the value in it, but I'm not sure how, if they continue doing it, once we're done with that, and we've moved on. It'll be nice to go back and see if it had any impact, or if they took it upon themselves to kind of continue using it. That would be interesting. Yeah.
I think with the IEM students, they're really good at reading and then putting it into writing, but they're not necessarily aware of the language. And so making them notice that, yeah, I think helps. Personally, that's in my experience. Shall we move on, Jinad? Oh, Darren, sorry, Darren with collaborative.
We can move on to Jinad, no problem. Mine is just an extension of what Mark had said, and also what Namala had said. But focusing on collaboration with a colleague. So some of you might remember Roland. He left CELC a few years ago. Let me just get the slides up. One moment. Okay, do I have the right slide up? That's a fear I have all the time, that I'm showing the right thing. Yeah, so we were teaching 1101 years ago, back in 2019. I was in that module for 1 year, and at the end, after I had done my stint there, I was curious to know whether or not, my feedback was in any way, impactful to the students. I mean, does it encourage my students to want to look beyond the constraints of 1101, for instance, or is my feedback purely just assessment based? So Roland and I did this collaborative reflection, where we looked at our own feedback. We didn't see our students' work, but we were looking at the feedback, and of course, the context where the feedback was given. We tried to understand our feedback practice. So Mark talked about collaborating with students. This is another form of collaboration that SoTL can have, and that is to work with a colleague who is probably teaching the same class. So that was very interesting, because when I got into this thing with Roland, I had in mind that dialogic feedback is the best. There's nothing that can top dialogic feedback, where you have an interaction with your students. But that collaboration with Roland made me realize that dialogic feedback there are a lot of limitations to it, actually. It doesn't necessarily encourage students, for instance, to look deeper into the content package, the readings, for instance, because it really just leverages on what the tutor or the writing instructor wants the students to do. So I think that was one of the biggest compromises that I had to make in terms of how I viewed dialogic feedback. And it also opened up doors, I think, to other theoretical approaches when we look at feedback, when we assess our own feedback. Yeah, and just this whole process of reflecting collaboratively, I think it's very critical, because it kind of begs you to question your own stand or your own views on certain things. Yeah. So, I mean, my question was, the kinds of compromises that we have to make, especially when we are doing collaborative work. And I think, for example, like Letitia and Namala, you've been working with people from other faculties, right? Like in developing the module, the narrative module. I mean, were there any compromises or anything that had to be, I don't know, changed in a way for both parties to work well together? Yeah, I think that was my intended goal for this slide. Yeah. Because it can be quite, I don't know, nerve-wracking as well, because, you know, you're so trained to look at something a certain way, and then, you know, you bring in other people into the equation, and it just kind of changes things around a little bit. Yeah, but it's a very liberating and exhilarating experience, I think. Yeah, it's just that I think we have to be courageous enough to say, oh, I didn't see it that way, you know, that kind of approach. Yeah.
I think you need to have good organization when you've got several people involved.
Yes.
You have to kind of pick what you're going to be more concerned with, rather than just, you know, saying, oh, let's do it as a group. I think it's better to you know, share out certain tasks. In my opinion, I found that's more useful.
Sure, yeah.
Otherwise, one person can end up doing more than another.
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know, Nam, do you want to say something? It's difficult to know where to start because we're just starting with the CDE, and so the differences are so you know, massive. They concern really massive things and also very minute things. So it's quite it's quite a mess, right? So but definitely we have different epistemologies, but they also have, there's engineering and design, and then there's architecture. So with Namala, we classify that, you know, according to a simple knowledge, knower kind of orientation. So we have the whole scope there. And then there's everything else, the way they work. So yeah, Mark is saying about organization. Yes, so sometimes we would expect some responses, we don't get them, or it's, I think we just have to really constantly be very accepting that our way of doing things is just really our way of doing things. And
I think it's just that we're informed by so much higher education research, right? We come from that background where I don't know, there's something different about the way, if you come from a disciplinary perspective, there are certain ways in which that discipline is taught, which is so different from, you know, and you never examine that ever. So I think that's where some of the difficulties occur as well. When you come in and for instance, me and Letitia were very specific about the kinds of rubrics we wanted, because we wanted to be able to be sort of standardized. We wanted to be able to, you know, be very specific when we were doing things like norming. And so we asked for collaboration on that. And then we realized from design, it's not such an explicit process. You know, they don't have to align things with key learning outcomes. They tended to be a lot more subjective. Yeah. So the lecturer would say, I really like that because, you know, it was a very nice, you know, looking piece of design, and we wanted that to be verbalized into criteria that then we could talk about with the TAs and the lecturers. And so it was a really, yeah, it's a steep learning curve, I think. And you're right, seeing it from different perspectives, it suddenly opens you up to the reality of this, you know, all this stuff that's been talked about by interdisciplinary learning. Well, it doesn't magically happen just because you bring two disciplines together. It's really a challenging process, and I wish that there was more written about it that was, you know, from the classroom perspective, that helps us understand how to you know, engage with that, I think, as well, because that's what all universities seem to be moving towards.
And that's why we put in a lot of effort at the beginning, just to kind of get on with these people, to kind of, you know, have a sort of collegial, you know, because in a way, as soon as you start becoming quite friendly and so on, it's harder to get into arguments, and so you're more likely to be more patient and make an effort to see the way people are thinking. And I mean, at the CELC, we have had for I don't know how long, but fairly rigid ways of doing things as well, and fairly, we're quite proud of saying, you know, we have all those systems in place, you know, in assessment and so on. And so it's quite easy for us to turn around and say, well, they're not doing it that way, and it's not, you know. So we have to just be very careful to manage to make it progressive, into kind of trying to, we could try it that way. Let's see. At the moment, basically, what we've said is we're trying it, and then we'll debrief. And so we'll see. The debrief will be maybe quite.
Even things like me and Letitia were like, okay, the rubrics, would you like to add anything to it? And then it was like what kinds of things? And we were like, okay, well, what did you cover in your lectures? Why don't we? And then I was like, shall I write it and show you the kind of thing that we would do? So I had to go to a completely new discipline, look at all their structures, what they were teaching, and then migrate that into a rubric and then get them to check it. And they were very impressed, like, that's amazing. That is exactly what I would put. And I said, because it's from your lecture notes, word for word. These are the things you said you taught in each lesson. And that's what I put into the rubric. So, being that kind of, they don't have that much thought out, I think. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing. It just requires, it depends on who's in control of it, who's coordinating, who's responsible for the quality. So if someone says, oh, students were unhappy because they felt there wasn't, there were hundreds, thousands of them, and some of them said that they were being marked unfairly. And, when issues like that come up, you have to be ready to justify the way that you did everything. And we wanted to be on top of that. But then we realized that's not the way that the other side works, so it was kind of enough to learn. Sorry, Jeanette's kind of patiently sitting there.
Yeah. Shall we move on, Jeanette?
Yeah, I'm fine to start if everyone wants to stay. I was going to talk about interdisciplinarity. I'm just going to share my slides first. Can you see this? Yeah. I'm going to keep this short. A lot of what I wanted to say has been said, really. So just very quickly, I was looking at this book, which I thought really spoke to me as someone who has not published in Soto, and really someone who's found the empirical work that is done, primarily in Soto, very, very much something that's difficult for me to get round. So just before, I wanted to talk about what interdisciplinarity means in different areas. So multidisciplinarity, where you keep your identity and you take from other disciplines. Interdisciplinarity, where there's a certain sense of sharing methods and goals. And transdisciplinarity, which you rarely find because it's sort of that muddy area where you no longer have a sense of identity as, discipline. And I think this is really in terms of where, my academic journey is where I see myself, because I've moved from various different fields in a way, and studied interdisciplinary work to a point where I can't really distinguish one from the other. But moving on anyway, the reason I wanted to talk about interdisciplinarity was because, like Darren, I taught 1101 for so long. I taught it for 3 years, I think 3 semesters. No, it was 2 semesters, right? And the thing about 1101 is that you have about 5 or 6 different disciplines to deal with, because it is ultimately one of those writing across general academic module things where you write across curriculum. And so there's a sense when you look at the rubrics, when there's teaching going on, that these disciplines are knowable across, across the board, that these general ideas are, are the same, so you can assess people the same way. And this again happened with the embedded module, so that as instructors, we think that, I don't know, I'm saying we, but I'm sure, like Namala talked about, teaching in the sciences. Everybody does this in CELC. We dabble in different disciplines, and there's a sense where I feel like we start with thinking there's a knowable set of rules that we need to apply to. And then when we look into the discipline, there's all these different, rules that apply to each different discipline. And when I was teaching 1101 particularly, I also came with those sets of assumptions that, I'm in the final humanities, so I should understand what a philo paper looks like. I should understand what, that supernatural paper, I think that was anthropology, I should understand these things. And then I find out like rules like we should not use the first person, which we apply across the board in CELC, right? It doesn't work. It's not true. And yet it's in our rubrics. across almost every embedded module, you have that, cannot use the first person. And then there's certain other rules. And then you realize there's all this stuff that you need to look at. And then there's also the interdisciplinarity of Soto. When I started out at CELC, I didn't know what Soto was. And I have a background in teaching, I have a background in pedagogy. And then I looked at Soto and I thought, oh, okay, you need empirical data, you need statistics, you need, to go and do quantifiable studies. So when I started reading this book, the book by McKinney, and I'm going to keep this short because everyone's talked about this, that's when I started realizing that this is not true. Of course, I've spoken to other people who've talked about autoethnography, Darren's work on reflections, I've talked to him about it. So I was aware of it, but there was still this, feeling like, oh, there's a certain way of going about things. And this particularly Grauhaus and Main, this chapter talks about the fallacies of using empirical research. So I don't want to get into it because, again, I think everybody knows this anyway. So their basic premise is really that, ultimately, there are these problems with quantitative research. Not only act as the, is part of the gatekeeper model that multidisciplinarity involves, but also that qualitative research has a place, because ultimately what happens with quantitative research is you start doing research for the purpose of research rather than the purpose that Soto was meant for, which is to improve teaching and learning, to look at how learning works. But what really, really spoke to me was this chapter by Nancy Chick. And she talks about the problems that people in the finer humanities like history and literature have with working in Soto, because there's this idea that the finer humanities are soft, in some way, that there's no theoretical basis for the work that is done in literature, for example. And so this is not, so these lines that I put in bold, that people who work in Soto, they're not maybe aware of the privileging of their approaches at the expense of those, strengths and expertise in other backgrounds. But who speak through other methods. And this idea that, that the disciplines, all of them have a rich basis of, through which we can do research in Soto. Right? So she talks about later in this chapter about using close reading. So just to go back to Victor's little explanation of Kant, when you talked about never really, what was it again? I wrote it down. Never merely as a means to an end. You were close reading, right? And you were close reading that phrase very, very carefully, based, I think, I'm going to put you on the spot here, but based on your background in the field of close reading. So Chick talks about how we can harness this and instead use this and these possibilities. And Jason, I know you're into philosophy, so I just wonder what you have to offer as well in your different practices, where we can harness this and use it for Soto. Yeah, so that's it. I think that's basically what have you done in terms of interdisciplinary research, and what would you want to do? So I think, given just a little aside, that Chick wrote that in 2013. So I wondered what she'd gone and done in terms of interdisciplinary work, and whether she had, taken on her own advice to look at literary practices and applied them to Soto. And she's done quite a bit on signature pedagogies and critique, where she's got people involved in like dance and performance to look at critique meaning the kind of things we do with feedback, for instance, and reflection. So looking critically at action and forming that pedagogy. So I thought that was pretty exciting and different anyway. So yeah, I've just wondered if anyone thought about doing research that is, you know, harnessing some ideas and knowledge and ways of thinking that are from your particular discipline.
Yeah, just to pick up on your point about close reading and that portion of the Kantian quote that you cited about merely, and how much, you know, that seemed to resonate with me anyway and have some significance for me. And it becomes a way of obviously critiquing other people's practice or their understanding of a particular field from which they're attempting to draw, but not perhaps quite as adeptly as they might, to satisfy certain sort of field experts anyway. So just to sort of check that my interpretation of it wasn't sort of locked entirely off base, I went searching for academic materials. So the one that I just want to flash up on the screen just now is titled "How to Use Someone Merely as a Means." Slightly provocative sounding title by a Kantian scholar that actually unpacks the significance of that single word in that particular formulation and tries to, you know, kind of understand the import of it from a sort of properly sort of Kantian perspective. So there's somebody sort of really sort of bringing their disciplinary expertise to bear on some, you know, single word that seems to trip up people from other disciplines that are trying to sort of feed off that, you know, leverage it as it were, but often sort of leave something quite significant out of the picture.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. That when we talk about words, we talk about it, you know, if you've had a discipline, if in a particular field, like I'm very attuned to words, and just one word, you know, in a text, or how I deal with students and quotations. I have this bugbear about students quoting and not explaining themselves. And I realize that comes from my disciplinary practice. I always say, if you're quoting a whole chunk, then you better pay the loan shark, because you borrowed from, you know, you borrowed, and then you better give back like 3 times as much. So you don't quote huge chunks. And I realize that when you're looking at other disciplines, they're fine with quoting 2 lines without providing, you know, a paragraph explanation, you know, because that's the sort of thing a literary scholar or, you know, a scholar in history would do. You know, that's the sort of thing I would do. And then I have to be aware of my own assumptions and prejudices as well.
Yeah.
So I wonder, Jason, did you have any, you know, like thoughts about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I'm new to this area of research, so I'm just starting to think of a few possible projects. But as you mentioned, I'm from philosophy, and currently I'm teaching 1101, so the module that you and Darren taught. Yeah, and one thing that I'm coming to realize is, indeed, as you mentioned as well, there are different types of writing styles across the different disciplines, and this is something that my students themselves bring up to me. Yeah, so I guess I am not, I don't really have a specific interdisciplinary research idea plan yet, but I'm just trying to think of what sort of common principles there might be that underlie all the different disciplines and how they write, which are manifested in their own different ways, and trying to bring that across to my students. Yeah, so rather than to ensure that they follow a certain rigid style, which maybe my own discipline does often, I can make it more flexible while retaining the correct idea, the spirit behind it. So it's still a work in progress.
I think 1101 is like really allows you to flex your interdisciplinary muscles, because when you're teaching, you're going, oh, that doesn't apply to this discipline, and that doesn't apply to that you, and you know, while you're talking to a whole class, while trying to maintain sort of key ideas within the argument. And I think that in itself, that those differences in themselves play to some kind of research that I hope to do eventually, you know, because I haven't had the, I don't know, I didn't get around to doing it, partly because of this problem that Chick brings up, that, you know, you feel a certain sense of loss when you think, oh, this is how research is supposed to work in Soto. It should be empirical. It should be, about collecting statistics. In fact, Chick actually talks about how, when you're involved in these disciplines, you always think you need to pad it up with some kind of social science background, and that's what happens. And she talks about how this kind of research tends to look amateurish, and the reason we don't do it is because ultimately we're academics, we don't want to look like amateurs, and so we don't get involved in it when we could actually get stuck right in with our own kind of thinking processes and gathering of information.
I think we've all been saying that it's complementary, haven't we? And that you should never really favor one over the other. I think it all depends on the context that you're in. What works best, I think, is important. I've been working a lot with people from the Centre of Sports Studies in Kuala Lumpur in the last few years. And that all the work that I do with them involves Excel sheets. It drives me mad. So recently for the Paralympics, we did a study on which sports, how often the sports were shown in the media, how often the genders were shown, who was involved in the media coverage. And over like the 2 weeks of the Paralympics, I collated all of this data, and I'm thinking, it's really unlike the usual kind of research I do. And with the same group, we did a recent paper on a bibliometric analysis. So looking at the research that's been done on the Special Olympics in the most effective journals, with the high impact factors. Again, lots of Excel sheet work. So I couldn't do that all day long, that's for sure.
I like what you said about that idea of, Jeanette, about like sort of feeling like an imposter when you come in to looking at something like this. But I think that's a nice thing about SoTL. Everyone is an imposter because it's, it's a good place to start publishing in a sense, rather than going to the sort of high ranked teaching journals, which are, some of them are really entrenched in their specific positions, I think, in terms of the kinds of research they'll publish in. I know, for instance, if I'm writing a more technical systemic functional linguistics based paper, I know that there are certain things I have to say and certain ways that I have to frame it that show my expertise and alignment with the discipline. Whereas I find that in some of the journals in SoTL, or even the more sort of starting out publications, they're a lot more free because people are coming from so many different perspectives. So it's kind of, so much of what we're talking about requires courage, right? I was thinking.
Yeah, I think so as well, because the thing is, you don't realize, because every paper I read, it's either some kind of reflection or some kind of statistically based work, and then I think, oh, well, what can I say, that will be, anything I say will be lame, so I don't say anything.
No, that's not,
but
it's just
so
about finding something that's small, that's workable, that you can talk about and publish, I think. And that's, it's part of the process. But I think with I think that it just takes a bit of, I'm just going to put it out there and see how it works, right?
Right.
And it's easier to do, I guess, in conference presentations and things, rather than in an actual publication where it's there forever. And there are instances where I look back and I'm like, I've changed my mind, or no, but of course, during the course of someone's career, you find them changing their minds, and that's okay. They found newer, better ways of explaining things, but it takes a lot of, you kind of have to be like, I'm just going to put myself out there.
I think this thing about the eye, for instance, I thought it was just a random observation I made, while we were going through assessments, and we have sit downs and we do norming, and then there's always 2 or 3 people within the team who say, you have to mark this person down because they're using the first person, and then somebody goes, oh wait, that discipline allows for it, you know, or someone says, you know, there has to be an argument, and in a lit essay there doesn't need to be an argument, you know, because the arguments are within the text. Really, you know, they're an intrinsic part of the way you think about text. So all these models of assessment, when we look at rubrics, for example, and how they're applied generally in you know, a general ACAD module. I don't know how you deal with it, Darren, because you deal also with a general ACAD module, right? Where you have postgraduates coming from different disciplines. What is the rubric like?
It's a little, I think, broad. And no, we had the same issues too. And I think it took some of us, especially me, some time to get used to. For example, you know, we have this thing where we say, don't start your sentences with conjunctions like but and and. And then we always get this backlash from our students because they'll bring us papers that they're reading and citing for their PhD study. And it has a bunch of sentences that start with and but.
Yeah, I do that. I use because and at the beginning of sentences.
Yeah. They're saying, you know, I need to publish in this journal when for me to graduate. So, you know, they're going to try to emulate what they see, that kind of a thing. And, you know, what can I say?
And I think it's also partly just the fact that you're making them aware that it exists and it's used in different ways. That's already, for me, I find I want to make my students into discourse analysts. I want them to put the glasses on, they see the matrix and they can't unsee the matrix. So then, like Mark has shown, these are the resources available to you. Let's look at the different way in which it's deployed. And then you can see them coming back to you, but it's also refreshing when they're arguing with you, because you're like, oh my God, they're actually paying attention and they understand that language is about, you know, the nuances in the journals which they need to publish in are things that they need to take into account. And that is so much more liberating than having these arbitrary rules across. Like there are rules about don't use passive voice. That's like one of those famous, Strunk and White, I think it was one of those famous books in which I looked at I actually did that for a lesson where I did all 5 of Strunk and White's principles and then showed them examples of how beautifully it works in like high ranked journals and people like Anderson who we were reading, and we all laugh because I mean it just depends on, you know, the context, right? Why are you using passive, for what purpose, and how does that there are certain things you just can't say in the active sentence, the active voice. Like for instance, you can't make, like, where is the researcher in science researcher? Most of the time they're not there because nobody cares who's doing the experiment. It's just that it was done, you know? So yeah, it's quite interesting, I think, to make them into.
I had the same issue with my engineering students. Like we don't care about who's doing it. We only have a number at the end of the sentence. Yeah.
Exactly. And yeah. Oh my goodness, run over.
Shall we wrap up? Yeah, I think what we can do is this is a great recording. What we should do is, if we do have time, we should do an FDC dialogue 2, whereby people watch the recording first, and then we come in and we chat about the content. If you have time, we could do that later on, not soon, but later on. And we'll be recruiting Victor from another space, I think, for that.
Oh dear.
Yeah, I'm always open to recruitment.
Okay.
Be the direction.
So maybe later on in June or something, if we got space, because at the moment June's not very busy.
Mark, don't make our June busy. We want to go on holidays.
I already
you'll
have
be
things on my plate for June.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Well,
But we will make time.
August or September then. All right. Thanks so much, everybody. It's brilliant.
Thank you all.
Jason.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.